Now, you have your own vaccine story to tell in just a second.
Yeah.
Now, we need to talk about Austria in just a minute because I think making the COVID jab compulsory by law is a very sinister step to take. But if you think about it, we have vaccine passports in both Wales and Scotland, and even in Britain, people are being coerced into the vaccination. So, for example, you have to travel for your work. And because of that, you've just had your booster jab because the government, of course, is threatening to up the ante on the definition of fully vaccinated from 2 to 3. So you had to take that precaution. You didn't want to get the booster, but you need to travel. As a doctor, that must be a particularly frustrating situation because you don't feel you needed the booster.
No, not only do I not feel I need it, I actually sought expert medical advice from respiratory doctors across Europe, people I work with. All of them, every single one of them said, you've had 2 vaccines, you've had COVID, it was confirmed, you should not scientifically have the booster. But I, like many people in this country, feel incredibly boxed in and frustrated. And I vented that on Twitter, and I call something of a Twitter storm. I think 200,000 people have seen what I wrote, which is that essentially I don't want this booster. There is no medical indication for me to have the booster, but the government has boxed me into a corner, whereas if I do not have that booster, I am restricted to being able to do certain things. They're taking away my liberty, and I feel very angry about that. I cannot travel. I cannot work, as you say, in other countries. It's not just the UK, it's across Europe. But we have to be very careful what we're allowing to happen here. If we look back a year ago, if I'd said to you when this all started, well, actually, it won't be 2 vaccines, it'll be 3 vaccines, there'll be vaccine passports, you'll have to show your papers to go to the cinema, the theatre, or indeed to some sort of sporting event, you would have thought I was absolutely crazy. But that is what we've allowed to happen. And I think it is very dangerous that we're just allowing the governments around the world just to do this, and we are being complicit in it.
Yes, I think we are right in the midst of a kind of very worrying mission creep right now. Now, you and I are both in England. I'm in London, where if you look around, life seems pretty much back to a kind of normality. But we forget that in both Scotland and Wales, we've got medical apartheid. If you cannot prove that you've been vaccinated twice, you're not allowed into various venues. You're not allowed to participate in various walks of life. So we've got it going on now. Now, over in Germany, the vaccine passport system is so strict that you literally do have a completely divided society where those who haven't been jabbed, who've taken the decision to decline to have the vaccination, I mean, they're not allowed even into shops, let alone restaurants and bars or theatres. So we are in danger of creating a divided society unless we forget, those of us in London and around England, it's already happening in Wales and Scotland. This is wrong, is it not?
It's totally wrong. And actually, if you look at the number of prescriptions for antidepressants, we're now at an all-time high. I think actually people haven't calculated what's really going on to people's mental health. People feel trapped. They don't see an end to this. You know, we were told, if you remember last year, I think, or was it the year before, you know, that we needed to do certain things so that we could save Christmas. We're starting to hear it all again. People are being compliant, of course, because they just want an end to this. They just want this to end. But if you look at the actual figures, the numbers of people in hospital with COVID are far lower than they were earlier in the year. So I hope we are through the peak of this. I just looked at the latest figures, and something like 17% have now had their booster. So we know, and there is a very big difference. And this is what I try to explain to people on Twitter, which was there is a very big difference for those over 50 with underlying health conditions. And I think they should have the booster on balance because your immunity goes up from something like 63% up to 93%. But there is a massive difference between that and 40-year-olds. And we're about to roll out boosters to 40-year-olds. And quite frankly, according to all of the medical opinion I've spoken to, that shouldn't be happening and it's not necessary.
And lest we forget, the vaccination, no matter what type, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, no matter what type you have, it does not guarantee you're not going to get COVID, and it does not guarantee you're not going to pass it on. It may make it slightly less virulent, but you can still pass it on. So it does beg the question, why is this government so obsessed with vaccinating as many people as many times as possible? They're already going down to 12-year-olds. They're now double vaccinating 16 and 17-year-olds. No one can really quite work out medically why that is the case. There has barely been a death in that age demographic all over the country. And there is talk, the other day, Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, did not dismiss or deny the possibility that we may go as young as 5 years old for these vaccinations.
100%.
This cushion approach is not really the answer, is it?
No, it's not the answer at all. I mean, vaccines play an important role, and I'm not an anti-vaxxer by any means. I think vaccines are very important, but there's a whole raft of other treatments that have come online that are shown to reduce progression of disease. But actually, the point is, if we are protecting the elderly and the vulnerable and those at most at risk, why on earth are we then trying to immunize children? We know that actually acquiring COVID naturally gives you better immunity than giving it through a vaccine. So I'm fundamentally against that. Also, all the medical reports I'm reading about endothelial problems, so aggregation of platelets, rising in inflammatory markers, all of the side effects of these vaccines. Where is the mainstream media reporting this? I don't see any of it anywhere. And parents around the country will be concerned about vaccinating their children. We've seen already that many parents don't want to vaccinate their children. I have a personal opinion on it. I won't let my nephews and nieces have it. I don't believe we have the long-term data, and I don't think it's right.
And there are other important principles afoot here, David. We cannot allow medical matters to overrule the important principles on what our free society is based upon. And by coercing people into vaccinations, by vaccine passports, so we are abrogating the freedoms of this country. And we have to, I think, enshrine the right of people to decline the vaccine if they want without repercussions. We have to stop acting as if the decision to have the vaccine is superior to a decision not to have the vaccine. You have every right to make either of those decisions, and I think a free society should not be punishing anyone either way.
What worries me most about this is it's actually pulling families apart, communities apart, and just the strength of feeling, say on Twitter, of angry people. So we're now divided into those that choose not to be vaccinated. And as you say, that is a very valid choice. And those that choose to be vaccinated. But what the government so cleverly has done is actually we're all fighting each other and not fighting against this oppressive dictatorship. And I do think, the fundamental tenet of Britain is that we don't believe in compulsory vaccination. Now, there may be an argument for certain settings like healthcare workers to be vaccinated. And I've wrestled with that, but I can see it from the fact that actually if they're vaccinated, they'll probably have less time off work and therefore be back in the workforce. But I think you need to be very careful. I was going to say it's a bit like hepatitis B, where I had to be immunized against that as a working medical doctor. But I think we need to be extremely careful what we're doing to society. The fact is we need to come together and to get over this crisis. And we're neglecting all of the financial aspects. All of those people who are really struggling. We're seeing the tax rises that will come in next year. We're already going to be struggling, and you're seeing inflation rise. I think people are in for a very miserable time.
I agree. Let's move on. I want to talk about the migrant crisis. I think you and I spoke about it this time last week, but since then, of course, Priti has issued her usual plethora of tough talking statements. I'm going to stop 100% of all of these crossings. I'm going to send people to Albania. I'm going to sort out the dysfunctional asylum system. I've always tried to give Priti Patel as much leeway as I can, because I do think her heart is in the right place. But I'm afraid she's at the point now where it's just all talk and never any action. When is she actually going to do anything? When is the Prime Minister going to help her do anything?
Well, absolutely right. It's all rhetoric, isn't it? You know, if you look at the numbers now, 25,000, I think we've thrown 52 million pounds at the French and asked them to sort it out. The French won't sort it out. Make no mistake about that. And we even said we would put border force in France, which France has politely declined. And the point is that people coming to this country see us as a very soft touch. If they'd flown in on an aircraft, would we let them into the United Kingdom? Answer no, they'd be turned around and sent home. And I do think we need to have a zero tolerance policy. I was talking to people who are witnessing what's going on. These boats are getting bigger and bigger. They arrive in vans, they're inflated very fast. You've got 80 people jumping on board these boats. There is big money at play here, big criminal gangs behind it, and these have to be stopped. And I think the only way to do that is to have zero tolerance and send the boats back. At that point, people will realize that actually you cannot get into the UK and it will eventually stop.
Yes, much play is being made of Priti Patel's upcoming borders and immigration bill. I've looked through a few of the clauses of it, and if you think about the Liverpool bomber who first had his application for asylum refused in 2014 and was still here 7 years later, having appealed several times and each time being denied. So just applying for asylum seems to be a right to stay here forever. Well, in Priti's borders and immigration bill, it'll limit the time you can stay here after you've had your application for asylum refused to 30 months, 2.5 years. Big deal. I mean, is that the best she can do? And the other thing I have to say, David, is Boris Johnson, who so far has been ludicrously diffident about this whole migration issue, not understanding that it means a lot to the people of this country, particularly people who voted Brexit in the belief that it would seal our sovereign borders. His approach has always been, well, it's the French, it's France's fault, they won't do enough. Priti Patel does a lot of finger pointing at the French. Now, much as I sympathise with that viewpoint, if we're just going to sit around saying, well, we'll never solve this crisis because the French won't do anything, we will never solve this crisis because the French don't really care. So we have to sort it out from our end and stop pointing the finger at the French, because the French are never going to help us. It's got to be us. We have to do it ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. It has to be us. And you're right. You know, the mantra of Brexit was to secure our borders, you know, to take back control of our money, our laws and our borders. And we do not have control over our borders. We're an island. We should be relatively easy to defend. There is a very real human cost to this as well. These people on the boats are humans and they're being used by these criminal gangs. When they get here, they have to be looked after. We have to provide education if there aren't any children that are coming across. And we also have to provide medical services. Who's paying for all this? Where are those services coming from? It's untenable. We simply don't have the resources. So we have to do it in as a humanitarian way as possible. But we need to send a very strong message that people who come here illegally will be returned back to France and then ultimately back to their country of origin.
And I'll tell you one thing, David, if Boris Johnson doesn't get a grip of the migrant crisis, it's going to be seriously politically damaging for him, to add to all of his other problems. David, always a pleasure to talk. Thank you so much for your time.